Operator Syndrome, episode 46. We're back on my timeline. At this point, it is 2008. It's the summer of 2008. And my next rotation, my second to last rotation, is going to be to Mosul, Iraq. Um, my last one was to Afghanistan, very kinetic, as everyone says. So a lot of fighting, a lot of good stuff, doing helicopter assault force missions, flying all over the country. That training cycle in between, um, I don't really remember that much about it. We did the same stuff we always do. Our training cycle or workups, is the same thing. Airfield seizure, team live fire, squad live fire, platoon, all that type of stuff. Individual training. I don't remember what I did. I think I did Stryker stuff. Stryker again being that armored
Mm,
vehicle that we use sometimes, which would come in handy when we went to Mosul. But
mm,
sort of like from an atmospherics perspective, um, in the platoon, this is around the time where suddenly I was one of the older, more experienced guys. So, in the previous deployment, I was I was definitely a new assault team leader. I'd been
mhm,
a gun team leader for a little while. That was my first as an assault team leader. And the bulk of the team leaders for that mission had been around a while and were around when I was a new guy, a private, a
mhm,
new guy. But that training cycle, a lot of those guys, it was just the way the cohorts sort of, ebb and flow. A lot of them left. They
mhm,
got out of the military. They went to selections. They went to become officers. They went to fly helicopters. They did all kinds of great things. And then suddenly I was, if I'm really thinking about it, I think I may have been the most experienced at that point team leader.
mhm.
Um, so that's an interesting thing when all of a sudden you're the old
Yeah,
guy. When
yeah,
you're like one of the more salty guys in the platoon, and we knew we were going to Iraq. Found out we were going to Mosul. Mosul's in the northern part of the country, very urban, right?
yeah,
A lot of that. It was going to be a lot of Stryker stuff, so we were going to move around the city in Strikers as opposed to what the platoon had been doing for a while. And I think I felt the weight of that. Um, the I don't know that anyone was necessarily looking to me as like a role model or anything like that, but you feel a little bit of that. And
yeah,
when you're in that weird spot, and the great thing is, you've got the leadership above you, who they know their stuff, and honestly, my peers who I may have had more experience than, but just their confidence is uplifting.
mhm,
Maybe that's strange, maybe not. So I'm thinking, well, if these newer guys are feeling pretty confident and they're looking good and they're performing good, then I can feel more
mhm,
relaxed, right? Because hopefully at least I'm attaining the same level as they are, right? So I didn't feel like we were going to go out there with a bunch of
mhm,
inexperienced folks. I felt like the younger guys who were now my peers um, were stepping up and they were doing good work and we were going to be able to do great things.
mhm.
Um, yeah, Mosul. Um, so Mosul it's an interesting place. If folks don't know what it was like in 2008, they may have heard about it later, and we'll talk about it, what happened to it later. Because what happened later, after we withdrew from Iraq, is um, ISIS came in there and just destroyed the place and just
Yeah,
made it, hell on earth, which is tough to deal with considering how much work we put in there.
yeah,
And that Mosul, it's basically all rubble. It's absolutely incredible. I've seen pictures of what happened to it, both during when ISIS took over and whenever coalition forces basically had to destroy the city to take it back.
yeah,
And it's absolutely rubble. But in 2008, it was still it wasn't the best looking city I've ever seen, but still thriving. Communities doing their thing. It was an interesting place.
mhm,
I'd been out. My first deployment, I was out in Western Iraq, out in the desert. The one real mission I went on was out in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of the desert. So, this was like my first time being in an urban area. And
Mhm.
for that time frame, urban combat was the thing that everyone was interested in. It was kind of like the sexy thing, at the
Yeah.
time. You had all like the video games, which were all about room clearing and fighting house to house. And everyone was thinking that they were going to have their own like Fallujah moment,
Mhm.
you know? And so, we were pretty amped to show up in Mosul and do work there. Um, so we were there was I guess it's the airport. It's what was the airport for Mosul. That's where the fob was. The I believe the largest fob in Mosul, Fob Merez, is
Mhm.
is what we called it at the time. It had been in the news before. I think earlier on in the war, a suicide bomber had you know, gone into the chow hall and clacked themselves off and killed a bunch of folks. Um, but it wasn't that big of a fob.
Yeah. A fob
Um,
for those civilian listeners, a forward operating base.
yeah.
So,
So it wasn't that large. And for this deployment, it was, I've said before kind of how it worked during the deployment. Sometimes a Ranger platoon would be paired off with a tier one unit to
mhm.
support them in however way we could. And then sometimes we operated independently. In this deployment, um, it was actually two Ranger platoons that were serving the JSOC mission set for Mosul.
Hmm.
So there wasn't a tier one. There wasn't constant tier one representation in Mosul during that summer. Um, uh, two Ranger platoons were the JSOC Joint Task Force
Wow.
operating the mission sets. Um, in and out during that summer, we were visited for by tier one units, special tier one units who would come into the city to do some work here and there. But they did not maintain a general presence. They were off busy in other parts of the country doing good
Yeah.
work. So, that was kind of interesting. Um,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, we did mostly Stryker operations. So operating from those, we had like four or five, I think it was, and we'd roll out in those and go out, and we were doing night raids. That's what we were doing. Um, I remember the very first mission we did there. um, just because I was just so I was just so amped up. Again, I was expecting like Fallujah, like house to
Yeah.
house fighting. And we do our first mission, and I'm in the back of a Stryker, and we're rolling through the city, and it's very urban. It's extreme. It's everything I'd seen on TV. It was everything that was in my imagination from how the city was set up. It was everything and everything that video games that showed me. So I remember the first mission, the ramp goes down, you know, it's a great,
Mhm.
great, like Saving Private Ryan moment. Like ramp goes
Yeah.
down, I step out and I look up, and I'm like, whoa, like we're on this street, 3-story high, all the
Yeah.
way down a block, down this way. And it's a completely different fight, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You're not looking at the hills. Now you're looking up and you're like, there's nothing I can do here.
Right.
If there's a dude, in any of these windows, we're
Yeah.
screwed.
Screwed. That that's something that is hard to wrap your head around. The vulnerability, and I honestly, I'm just as a kind of a tangent. I think that's what the Russians are experiencing in Ukraine. Any able-bodied person with a rifle in a high rise or a apartment, it is just nasty. You got to clear ostensibly to make it safe. You'd have to clear every room and every building. I mean, you think about that's not easy to do. Even tier one units, gosh, you can only clear so much, and it's still hairy. So yeah.
Yeah, and I was struck by exactly our vulnerability. It was just like there's no way to know. There aren't enough rifles to stick up in the air or at every door.
No way.
If it's gonna come, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. And over time, obviously, got very comfortable. Um, maybe even complacent, which I think is sort of normal. But I remember that moment stepping off the ramp and looking up and just being like, danger everywhere,
Yeah.
seeing danger everywhere. And, that deployment, there were a couple times we got shot at, but, it was, we didn't really. We were doing most of the targets we would go to, it'd either be a dry hole, it'd be the wrong
Mm.
person. But we didn't get into too many gunfights. There were a couple moments. I'll talk about those, but by and large, we basically follow the same script every night. And
Hmm.
the thing that that deployment was really known for was just how many times we went out every night.
Oh yeah.
So I talked about in the previous deployment, which there was a lot of, back and forth with the enemy. We probably went out once a night, and really that's all you could really do
Hmm.
because of how long the flight times were. You fly an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to your target. You do your thing. It's daytime by the time you get out of there. You're flying back. There's not a whole lot of time to do multiple follow-ons. But when we were in Mosul, it was unbelievable. Um, I think the most we did in a night, I think we got into double digits one night.
Wow.
10, I would say 10 to 12 hits in a single night.
That's
Y-
wild.
you'd roll up on a house, hit it, follow on. Hey, pack up, let's go. Next house over, or next house down the block, or hey, we got to get across town. It was
Mhm.
unbelievable, and I
Yeah.
honestly felt like to me like I was more like in a big city SWAT team than
Yeah.
I was in you know in a special operations infantry unit.
Yeah.
Honestly felt like I was a SWAT cop,
Yeah.
and 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 that's what the schedule was like. It's like anytime. Mostly we operated at night, right? Because we have the advantage. But um, but we're waiting for the pagers to go off, so to speak, and to get told to go out, and that's what we were doing. So, I would say it wasn't uncommon. I would say typically we'd hit at least two homes. So we'd go, we'd hit a house. I'll talk a little bit about our setup, just since it's in the past. I don't think there's any TTPs to risk. But you'd go, you'd hit a house, do your thing, clear it, and then they would figure out some reason to do a follow on. They, talking to the people who were there, and they say, okay, well, you mentioned your cousin a couple times. We're gonna go visit your cousin. All right, everyone, pack up, get in the trucks,
Yeah.
and let's go. So at a minimum, two a night, every night, no nights off. And I'll talk about it, but that in a lot of ways, that op tempo messed me up way more than getting shot at ever did. It really stressed me out.
Yeah.
So our
Was
s-
your was
Go ahead.
your being in these strikers, would you say one of your biggest threats were IEDs? I mean, yeah, if somebody taking pot shots out of the window, I guess that's kind of obvious, but what were you most worried about?
So IEDs were a threat. It's something we worried about. We did not encounter it all that often. I think operating at night, there had to have been there's definitely a curfew in effect because at nighttime the roads were pretty much empty. They
Yeah.
were empty by and large. They were empty, so there must have been some kind of curfew, vehicular traffic.
Hmm.
So vehicle-borne IEDs were big 2008. Obviously, huge thing. Vehicle-borne IEDs. IEDs are on the road. So having that curfew in effect gave us free range, operating. Um, and I'm trying to. We were never. Our convoy was never hit by an IED, and I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah.
The other platoon, our sister platoon from our company who was operating there, we would basically trade off, like alternate doing missions. And so I believe one time they went out, and one went off, but missed their convoy. So yeah,
IEDs are improvised explosive devices. Those are everything from shells that have been rigged to, well, you name it, just all kinds of ways to rig explosives to blow the crap out of something. That was a big problem, not maybe necessarily in any one time in any one place, but across the campaigns. Got a lot of guys got messed up with those and killed.
yeah, guys who were I can't remember a specific instance, but I'm nearly certain that the conventional forces
Yeah.
that were in Mosul at the time, and I want to say it was the Second Infantry Division is
Hmm.
who was there, I believe, at our time. You know, we'd hear about them getting, taking one during the day and you could
Yeah.
hear it and sometimes you could see the smoke. But for us, we were the threats that we had the ability to operate in the roads how we wanted to at night. We were still I remember a big thing was watching for grenades getting chucked at the top of the strikers as we'd be
Yeah.
stopped or rolling by. That was a big thing we were worried about. And
Hmm.
there's kind of a funny, sort of a funny story that I'll tell about that. But so that was a thing, and then obviously just pot shots that were going by because when we'd be in the striker, we'd be for those who had access to a hatch, we'd be hanging out of the hatches.
Right.
It provides additional security, so we wouldn't be buttoned up
Yeah.
necessarily. So we'd have a couple extra guns out there, and so that was just something to watch for, just because you're hanging out there. I also believe like wires strung up was maybe a thing we're worried about.
Hmm.
But I won't confirm that. I can't remember. So, um, our setup was well. Let me tell maybe kind of the funny story. There are a couple of them. So, especially towards the beginning of the deployment, we were we're on guard about everything, right? So we were all in Afghanistan the past two deployments. Now we're here in Mosul, and it's very urban, and we're our senses are heightened. So we keep hearing about, hey, they've been chucking grenades up, like you'll be at a blocking position, or you'll be parked, or you'll come under a bridge, like they'll chuck a grenade at you, so watch out. So we're very on guard. So one story, I wasn't there for either of these, but I gotta tell them because they're funny. So
Hmm.
I don't claim credit for these, nor can I substantiate that they're 100% truthful. So one of them was, we're doing a raid, and um, what would happen is the strikers would go and they would be our blocking position because they had remote mounted 50 caliber machine guns, and so they would go into the blocking positions while the assault teams would go in and clear and raid the house and look for whoever we were looking for. So one night we're doing our thing. We're clearing the building. When we're clearing, we're using flashbangs. We're doing our thing as we're going through these houses, and then one of the strikers are posted up somewhere, and the TC, the team leader who is in charge of that striker, he's sort of chilling, watching, looking around. He's got his back to the target though, because he's looking out, pulling security, and he hears like chunk, tink, 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 and he hears
Oh,
something land on the top of the striker. Um, and then he yells and he moves and gets out of the way. Well, nothing detonates. And he sort of turns around and he hears it again. Chunk, tink, 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 tink. He's like, oh, what the fuck's going on? So he turns around and looks, and the sergeant major who's with us, he's policing up flashbang bodies from the raid that we just did, and he's throwing them up onto the top without saying warning
without
the
letting
guy.
him know. God, gonna give somebody an aneurysm.
He's like, "Hey, we gotta clean these up." It's like, "Hey, Ranger, we gotta clean the we're just cleaning up."
Yeah.
And like that, can you imagine that team leader? He's like
No.
scared to death, pissed off,
Yeah.
but it's the sergeant major.
Yeah. What are
It's
you
like,
gonna do? Oh man, that is
and,
funny.
and then that's like a very sergeant major thing to do, to be
Yeah,
kind of a
right.
little out of touch, sort of.
Right.
He's like, we need to clean up the
Yeah.
banger bodies. Like these weren't reusable ones. He was
Right.
just picking them up and then tossing them to the top of the striker.
Yeah. Keeping Mosul green.
Yeah, exactly. So that
Yeah.
was funny. And then the other one that I heard, which was like a one in a million shot, was I think they were posted up and we had Apache support. I believe it was Apaches. We at the time we had mostly Kiowas, which are awesome. So the 160th is great.
Yeah.
Love the 160th and the little birds and all the stuff they have.
Yeah.
But the Kiowa pilots that
Yeah.
we used to have, they got rid of that bird. But those guys were something else too.
Oh yeah.
Those guys and gals were something else. They were crazy good. And so, but whichever bird, I guess one of them has flares. They have the ability to push out flare. Maybe
Yeah.
both of them do.
I
I don't
think they
know.
both do. The
So
later marks. Yeah.
I can't remember if they were supporting us or just something else that was going on in the area. But part of what they were doing was letting off flares. I don't know the specifics, but the crazy thing was is that one of the flare canisters, whatever, made a 1 in a million shot, like hit like the TC's in his hatch, bounces off the bounces off bounces off like the TC and goes into the striker.
Whoa.
And he actually, I think this story was my buddy. I think it was Jose. So I think it hit off him into the, and then he basically said like he thought he was done.
Oh,
He couldn't do anything. He couldn't say anything. Maybe he said grenade, but he just sort of winced and like braced himself to get blown up until he figured out what it was.
yeah.
But that's crazy, right? Like an
Yeah,
Apache
that's
flying
nuts.
over and just lands in the hatch, and the hatches aren't that big, right?
Right. You're
So
talking about the defensive flares that they
yeah.
put out. Yeah, for if you're listening and you don't quite know, they're evasive measures for um, fighters and different kinds of fighting aircraft. One of the defensive measures is to put off a flare that's hot, obviously, because if they're being tracked by a heat-seeking device, the idea is that it will lock onto the flare and not the helicopter or the plane or whatever. So that's what those are. But yeah, they're kind of there's not a whole lot of control about where they're going to go. They're just dumping them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's nuts.
It was yeah, so that's pretty crazy. But I said I'd talk a little bit about our setup. So 90% of the time we were going in the strikers. For us, a ranger platoon is organized pretty much along the same lines as a conventional infantry platoon. So three, rifle squads, or we call them assault squads, and then you have a weapon squad, which is made up of three or four gun teams. So when we got to when we got to Iraq, what we did was we made the gun teams. So the guys who would usually carry the 240 and the
Mhm.
tripod and all that type of stuff and the ammo, they became our basically our mobility teams. So each gun team would take a striker, and that would be theirs. The gun team leader would be the TC, or I think that stands for tank. I think technically is like tank commander. Basically, they would be
Yeah.
the team leader in charge of the truck, and then the one of their guys would be the driver, and the other guy would operate. And then the other guy would be, I guess he operated the weapon system.
Mhm.
That can't be right because you don't need a crew of three. Maybe it was just two. I think maybe it was just two.
Yeah.
Because I think the gun team leader was the one who operated the RWS, the remote weapon system. Time is making me forget. But
Yeah.
anyways, so that's what the setup was, and then everybody else was just part of the strike force.
Mhm.
And basically what we would do is we would set up the trucks, we roll into the objective, we get drop off, ramp comes down, everyone flows off. We would usually walk a couple blocks if we could, if it made sense. Sometimes you would land on the X and you'd just be right in front of the house, and then you go to town. But usually we like to walk to maintain and the strikers were pretty quiet, quite honestly.
Mhm.
It's not like it wasn't like they were Bradleys or tanks that,
Chinook.
yeah, or yeah, or a Chinook. They weren't, they have these strikers, they're wheeled. They've got eight wheels. They're not
Yeah.
that noise. It's not like hearing like a Panzer coming down the street. Like if you're sleeping, which most of the time most people were, you're not really going to pay much. You're not really going to hear us. So but still we'd walk like a block or half a block or whatever. Um, and they would post up at the corners, very Black Hawk Down style. So they'd
Mhm.
post up and look out with their remote weapon systems, and they'd wait for us. And then the strike force would go to the building. We'd set up on the building just like we did in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
So you have inner cordon, you'd have first and second assaults, and then you'd assault.
Yeah.
At this time, we were still just straight up assaulting houses, kind of like the fun way, some people will say.
Yeah.
So we'd set up a breach. Well, it changed over time, and I'll talk about that. But especially at the beginning, set up an explosive breach, blow the gate, blow the door, and then go in and start to clear. Where there were where there were big differences was where there were big differences was just like the type of domiciles that we were clearing. So, in Afghanistan, we're used to mud huts,
Yeah.
with like rooms one person could barely fit into, or no door or curtains. If you hear that, it's my heater going nuts. Thought I turned it off. But here now we're in a relatively modern, city that's got like actual doors with
Yeah.
hinges, and some of them are pretty nice. Some of them are pretty nice places, and they've got rooms that look like our rooms. So now you're actually clearing, I'll say Western style, more
Yeah.
more modern style, homes. And
Right.
oftentimes they're, minimum 2 floors. Oftentimes they're three. um, so, um, and so, yeah, so that was the big difference. Um, you'd do your SSE, sensitive site exploitation. Again, because this is more of a modern setup. There's more stuff to look through. More
Right.
technology, more paperwork. In Afghanistan,
Yeah.
you'd clear a home, and it'd be like they got a couple grocery store bags with some shit in it, and that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Sack of food, some carpets. It's an easy day, right, to just go through that stuff. But now
Oh.
you're in like someone's actual home, and they've got files of
Mm.
paperwork and this, and they've got computers, and they got TVs, and they've got PlayStations, and so there was a lot more work involved in doing
Mm.
SSE. And for us at the time, generating what the next target was, right? Because we
Right.
kept doing follow-ons. Um, at the time we had I talked about them before, but we had federal law enforcement uh, individuals attached to us at the time, and different platoons use them differently, but by and large, people use them for investigative interrogation purposes. So, so while we're doing SSC, the people that we're in the house with, they're doing a quick battlefield interrogation to figure out if they are the right person, they know the right people, who should we go talk to, who's the next person. Then we'd wrap up, carry a bunch of shit and
Hmm.
dudes, um, detainees off into the trucks, and then we'd either go back to the fob, or we might just do a follow on
Hmm.
right from there. And that was, like I said, we just did that over and over and over and over and over. Um, on a couple missions they did have a couple helicopters there from the 160th. I don't know if they were based out of there or if they just flew there for the times we needed them. We did a couple helicopter assaults, but instead of riding in Chinooks, we got to ride in the Blackhawks, um, which
Yeah.
is, it's a blessing and a curse. If you get a door seat, it's better. If you're like
Yeah.
sitting in the center on top of a ladder, you got like a ladder up your butt. That
Yeah.
sucks.
Not as comfortable depending on where you're located.
Not as comfortable, but it feels sexier, when you're like in the
Yeah.
door and you're like landing on the X to do a raid, you get your feet up, you land, and you run
Yeah.
off towards it. Like that's pretty cool. You did a couple
Yeah.
of those. Um,
More like feel more like a tier one guy coming out of a little bird. Boots
that's
on the
right.
ground.
Exactly. Exactly. Um,
And they're more maneuverable. I mean, man, the CH-47s are just so huge. It feels like a
mhm.
whole city landing. Man, those things are so loud and just a huge bird. But
Oh man, I remember. So I remember we did one mission. We're in the Blackhawks. I'm sitting in the door. So you sit in the door. You've got your own. Again, we had our own individual lanyards to snap into the floor, but then you got the troop strap, right? And for those who don't know, it's just like a
yeah,
thick piece of It's a strap. It's like a ratchet strap. It's like a commercial grade ratchet strap. It just goes across the door. Well, you're holding on there. You're chilling. You're getting ready to land. When you land, you have to put your feet up. Everyone sticks their feet up, just so you don't. I mean, for the Black Hawk, I don't know that you're actually at risk of your
right.
feet getting crushed underneath the black. Although you never know, right? Something could
Yeah,
go wrong, or the terrain could be uneven. There could be like a boulder there, and they didn't see it, and then you get your
right.
foot crushed. You stick your feet up. So we were coming into land. We got our feet up, and then we get in a brownout. You
Uh,
know, everyone has these brownout stories, but we get in a brownout and you're just like kind of like shifting around. And I just remember because you're talking about the maneuverability, how they're way
mm,
more maneuverable, and the pilot just like does this, pulls up. I don't know what they're doing with the controls, but pulls up and we're in the brownout. I see nothing. I know it's not good. I had that experience in Afghanistan. I'm like, oh, here we go again. But then he comes up and I just feel like the G forces and I see a flash of like there's brownout and then it like there's like a little clearing in the brownout and I see power lines and he just like dips and then he dips over and he like like comes back around. I was just like wild. And because we're in the door, have a great view of what you were
yeah,
just sitting in. So you just got like this brownout, and I saw the power lines, and comes back around, and then eventually puts us down a little bit further away than I think we wanted to be. But I'm okay with that.
yeah, yeah,
I'm okay with that. And then we just go running for the target building. But from the maneuverability, I would just like to just be in that seat sitting there whenever you're just getting whipped around. It was
yeah.
pretty wild, scary and wild. Um, Man, what else about that deployment? Well, and we're starting to run out of time here, but over the course of that deployment, um, we'll have to take this to another episode. But over the course of that deployment, our tactics changed. Again, this is like over 12, 15 years ago, so I feel comfortable talking broadly about it. But like I said, at the very beginning, it was very much like, um, and we were and our platoon was used to being in Afghanistan and used to being a little bit lazy, right? In the sense that it's really easy to clear a mud a mud room,
Yeah,
right? Once you can fit through the door,
yeah,
it's
that's
pretty much a no-brainer. Unless there is a carpet or a rug or curtains hung up and you just got to rip. Other than that, it's pretty much a no-brainer. But now you're in a modern building with doors and hinges that can lock and it's more like the shoot house, right? There are more variables there. And at the beginning of the deployment, it was very much we're blowing everything when we first show up, and we are getting two, three, four dude. We're piling dudes into every single room, and we're locked down on everything. We're being like very much like a shoot house,
mhm,
but we're doing it over and over and over and over and over again, and over time, and also from the lessons learned from other Ranger platoons, SEAL platoons, uh, Marines, Green Beret, everyone, at the time there was a lot of information flow and
yeah,
lessons learned from where things went well and things didn't go well, and learning from the tier one guys who are out there,
yeah,
helping to develop tactics. We're pushing that down to the rest of us. And so it was during that deployment that I saw a big change in the way that we were doing our raids.
mhm.
Um, you know, we had started to, let's see, how much do I get into this? I'll I'm going to use this as a cliffhanger. So I'm going to use this as a cliffhanger. So what I'll say is that we from those lessons learned, from the beginning of that deployment to the end, we saw big changes in the way we would go, and we became quieter.
Mhm.
um, we utilize the space that we had. We use like the vertical space within
Mm,
building that a modern building presents to give put us in more advantageous
mm.
positions. And over time we trusted the individual ranger more to make smart decisions in their clearing. And I will explain that in more detail in the next episode.
Excellent, excellent. A cliffhanger. Good. Yeah, I want to hear more about it. I didn't I've heard from buddies about stuff specifically to do with Mosul. We were doing, I mean, our guys were doing a little bit different stuff than, I mean, of course they may have used strikers. I don't think so though. Not SEALs usually.
If it was tier one guys, they would use these things called panders, which is basically like little strikers.
Right.
But also, if the tier one guys came into town and they needed a ride, well, they have the ranger platoon, give them a ride. They
Give them
arrange
a
a
ride.
team to
Yeah.
pick them out, shuttle them off. That happened maybe once or twice while we were there, but they like the autonomy of their own panders and
Yeah.
going off and doing their thing. So
Yep. Awesome.
okay, well, that's number 46. We'll pick this back up in the next episode. Thanks for listening.